Hey y'all, welcome back for our study of the Gospel of Mark. Today we're going to dive into chapter 5 and 6. There is a lot there. Thank you so much for joining me. But I wanted to just note, I'm here in the sanctuary. We've just recorded worship for this week. I wanted to thank y'all. Thank y'all for bearing with us, for praying with us, for being with us, for speaking with us during this profoundly difficult and clarifying week in our lives as a people and as a nation. One of the things that I have learned about Christian discipleship is that much of what we do, much of what we are called to do, is to be challenged and to be exposed. We are called to offer honest assessments of who we are. That is a cornerstone of what it means to be reformed. And we've all had to do a lot of that this week, and we're going to have to do so much of it moving forward. And I through so many of y'all's messages of encouragement, I have come to realize what a gift that is. Discipleship is about listening for the call of God. We see that in the Gospel of Mark, the listening and response. And sometimes God calls us using others' voices. We are at a critical moment right now where we should listen to how God is asking us to engage in our world. And I'm just so grateful for you as a community. I'm grateful that so many of you are stepping up and accepting the challenge. So thank you. So we're going to do Mark from here. I'm going to do it standing up. I've been a little cramped these past couple weeks. I'll probably move around a whole lot. I apologize. I'll try to keep myself stationary so I'm not just wandering off screen. But here in Mark 5 and 6, we have two unique stories that I really want to focus on, and then a few other peripheral stories. Especially chapter 5, when we see at the very beginning the story of the Gerasene demoniac. A few things that I just want to note. We should see immediately, the second we get into chapter 5, we understand that we are no longer in Jewish territory. Jesus has crossed the sea and is now in Gentile territory. He is among folks who are not his own people. And we remember from last week that not everyone who was his own was receiving him well. We're going to see that again later this week. But we know immediately that Jesus is no longer in Jewish territory. That's going to be important for a few reasons. I want to mention one thing, though, when it comes to form criticism. Mark is in such a rush to make a theological point that he doesn't exactly do careful work with his geography. There is no such place right off of the coast of the Sea of Galilee. There are 3 cities that it could have been in ancient Palestine where this Gerasene demoniac was. One of them would have been 3 hours away from the ocean, or the sea, One of them would have been 3 days away. There's no sense that there's sort of geographical unity here. Mark is trying to make a point when he has Jesus land in Gentile territory and immediately have a conflict with a demoniac, with a strong man, with the powers of evil. Remember, so much of what Mark is doing is proving to us, showing us that to be God means to be sovereign over all powers of death and destruction. And it's important that we see that that is not just in Jewish territory. Yes, this is where Jesus is primarily doing his work. And we should remember that this first time Jesus finds himself in Gentile land, it calls back to that first public act of ministry that he did when he exorcised a demon in a synagogue, outside of a synagogue. But what Mark wishes us to understand is that Jesus Christ is not limited and not bound only within one context, one geography. Jesus' authority and power reaches beyond the places that humanity has drawn its own sort of map around. Jesus' authority starts in Jerusalem, yes, but it goes to all of the nations. There are 3 things immediately that tell us Jesus is elsewhere. There's the presence of pigs, which would have been functionally anathema in the Jewish context. There's a man who is living with these unclean spirits. He would have been unwelcome if he were in trying to approach the synagogue. And we see him also living among tombs, triply unclean. Mark wishes us to know Jesus is not in Kansas anymore. So Jesus and the disciples arrive. The disciples really only witness the scene. They play no role, and we see this immediacy. Jesus is confronted with this man. I want to note here one thing that you may miss if you aren't reading in Greek or paying attention to the Jewish wars of the late 60s and early 70s. The occupying Roman armies that were all throughout Palestine and in Jerusalem were called legions. And the 10th Legion in particular, which was really active in Jerusalem and surrounding Jewish areas, the 10th Legion had on its insignia a boar. Now, when when Mark narrates that there is a herd of swine, that word sounds normal to us. We've heard of this, that, and the other. But the word that he uses in Greek there would have been rather inappropriate to talk about swine or any other animals. What it was used commonly to describe was groups, legions of Roman or other armies, soldiers. This is not a story primarily about the conquering Romans who were oppressing Jews and persecuting young Christians in Mark's context. This is a story about an exorcism. This is a story about a demon, and this is a story about God's power over that demon. However, it also would have been heard in the first century with profound political overtones. Here we have an occupying force, this demon in this territory that is banished, that is destroyed by the power of God. We have a legion, and even the legion is not so strong that it overcomes Jesus Christ. We should be able to hold both things in our minds. Mark is always primarily talking about that demonic realm. He's talking about the forces of evil that separate people from what they were intended to be, from their communities. That's always where Mark is, but he's doing something else here also. Those militaristic overtones should remind us, would have reminded the reader, that just as he bound the strong man in Judea, in the countryside, just as he will bind this strong man and send all of this legion of demons into this herd of pigs, Jesus Christ is also greater than any empire, and greater than any emperor, and greater than any army. And that though those things remain, though legions would have remained in Mark's immediate context, though there would have been any number of reminders that they were under occupation, though those things remain, Jesus was ultimately victorious. So, getting back to this text, we have this huge confrontation between the demons, the man, and Jesus. And it's a little insane here. Even in the English, you see that there's a switch back and forth between my name is Legion, for we are many. There's the one man who seems to be struck by many, many demons. There's all of these demons, so many that they go into a flock as large as 2,000 swine. But there's a sense of urgency, there's a sense of madness that's even communicated in the way that Mark writes this story. This is the longest miracle story in Mark, by the way. The I and we, the shifting possessives. There is a sense here, again, and we've seen this before, that when Jesus does this, and see and note, he does it without a struggle at all. There's no great conflict. Jesus seems to have already really done these things by the time the man can even say, what do you have to do with me? Jesus is not just saving, making well, making whole this one man. This is a confrontation with evil. And Jesus is vanquishing evil. Look, you read this first part of the passage. The man could not be, he was out in the tombs because he could not be controlled by any other means. Chains could not hold this man. He was so possessed by demons. But Jesus, with his word, this is a powerful indicator of who Jesus Christ is and of what his ministry is about. Now, we can ask questions. We can ask questions in all of the stories that are going to continue in this. What does it mean exactly that there is a demoniac realm? What does it mean that a girl was healed or raised? What do all of these things mean? Did Jesus really feed 5,000? Mark does not ask those questions. Mark's purpose is showing Christ's authority. I want to note, too, a couple other things. In the 20th and 21st century, really, when people started to read this story and they saw these demons banished into the pigs and the pigs throwing themselves in this violent and kind of darkly funny, frankly, story, especially if you're reading it with these strange overtones that Mark implies, when you see all of this, 21st century, all of a sudden, critics started saying, well, what about, there's like a PETA overtone. Well, what about the pigs? My goodness, we destroyed all of these pigs, God's good creation. And then perhaps quite consistently, very late in the 20th century and even now, many modern commentators say, well, what about the fact that an entire farmer's livelihood seems to have been taken away? 300 would have represented a fortune, but 2,000 pigs thrown off a cliff, a man's livelihood is gone. Those are modern concerns. That doesn't mean they're inconsequential, but they are modern. Consider that when the man goes, when we see all of the people coming into the area to see what Jesus has done, none of them say, how dare you ruin my flock? None of them say, how dare you mistreat these pigs? They are afraid because the man is healed. They are not afraid because all of their money has run off of a cliff. Those are modern concerns. What Mark means to tell us is that what these people supposed, this closed world order, where a demoniac would remain a demoniac until he died, this sort of fixed place, this is where you belong, this is where these people belong. What Mark tells us is that in the presence of Jesus Christ, by his authority and his word, those worlds begin to break down. They are afraid when they see Jesus because the world is changing in the presence of Jesus. We'll see that when Jesus returns home too, by the way. If you've already read into chapter 5 and 6, you know that. There, the townspeople who come to see this man healed have a completely opposite reaction to the man himself, who begs, who asks, who wishes to be made one of the 12. Let me join you. And Jesus denies that request. He gets in the boats and leaves when the villagers tell him to leave. He sends the swine where they're the pigs, the demons where they want to go, but he will not allow this man to be one of his disciples. It's a strange moment. Why? Well, one thing Mark also wants to show us is that the beginnings of Jesus' ministry to the Gentiles did not only come after his resurrection, that Jesus was doing wonders, was offering healing and wholeness before even the cross and resurrection. Jesus, this is a prefiguring of the later mission to the Gentiles after Jesus' death and resurrection. Mark wants the Gentiles in his community to know that Jesus was there with them also. And so having this man break the messianic secret, remember when Jesus, to this point, when he is healed, when he's taught, he has always told people not specifically, do not tell. In this context, he charges this man with going and telling among his community. The man goes even further. He preaches. He has great success, presumably. This is, in some ways, an origin story for Mark, for the church and Gentile community. But greater than any other thing, it's a story about Jesus' authority, Jesus' word, and about the good that has already been accomplished in the inauguration of Jesus' ministry. It's a strange story, though, there's no doubt about that. It's a frightening story in many ways. It's an odd story, and it makes us uncomfortable. I think this realm, the idea of demoniacs, this is difficult for us, and we might want to say, well, these are psychological issues that Jesus was battling with individuals. We can say all that. We can speculate. Mark is telling us something else. Mark is trying to get to a deeper truth. I don't think Mark is making a statement about Jesus and mental health. Mark is making a statement about the ultimate conquest of evil in the world and the fact that Jesus' actions are always to save human life, right? The pigs are sent off that the man might be given life. The man who was forgotten, the man who was utterly outcast from society. And his healing, his life, his witness is a threat even to these Gentile systems. It's worth us really thinking about that, especially now, that the wholeness of some among us can evoke in people a response of fear, where it should evoke a response of worship and gratitude and a profound willingness that the world as we see it is not as the world was created to be. We go immediately, using one of Mark's favorite words, into a new story after we have this encounter with the demoniac. So we have the encounter with the demoniac. Jesus takes this ride into Gentile territory, and then what does he do? He does all of these things, and he turns right back around, and he goes back into Jewish territory. Just like swine, the presence of swine and cemeteries and are always indicators that you're in Gentile territory, the presence of the synagogue, the presence of concerns around ritual cleanliness, those are always going to mark that we are back in Jewish territory. So Jesus is back in Jewish territory, and we have an incredible story of two women who are healed, who are given life. And I do want to spend some time in this story because it's really incredible. This is one of those stories, I've alluded to it in the past. It's called a Markan sandwich, intercalation. It's called a lot of things. But what that basically is Mark has taken one story, a whole story. In this case, it's a story about Jairus, his daughter who was sick, who died, and who was raised. So we take this story, and then in order to interpret it, to amplify it, to give both stories meaning, he inserts another story into that one. So the hemorrhaging woman here is the vegetables in the bread sandwich that is the story of Jairus. That is, just don't think about that too long, but that's what we have here. So Mark is setting up a story about, one other way we know that, most people think that Mark took this story of the hemorrhaging woman and put it into the dialogue regarding Jairus and his daughter, because you also see a radical shift in tense from the present to the past when Jesus is interacting in the Greek with the woman who was hemorrhaging. A couple other things. Mark uses the phrase sozo, which many translations translate as saved. In the NRSV, it's translated in this text as be well. Mark uses that phrase, that word, three times in this one sandwich story. He uses it 14 times in the whole gospel. Mark is communicating here something about what it means to be made whole or to be saved. You know, like many words in our English language, we've cut off some of the richness of language around salvation. Many of us will go to an altar call or just this idea of some eternal great future when we think of salvation. For Mark, and presumably for Jesus, the way Mark interprets him, when someone is saved, they are restored to the fullness of life. Of course, it has dimensions beyond this life. There's no doubt about that in the biblical witness as a whole. But in these stories, it is more focused on the complete wholeness of the human being than on some future salvation. So, we begin. Jesus has crossed again to the other side, and a great crowd, of course, great crowds are always gathering around Jesus. So, what happens? One of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus. I want to mention two things here. Well, actually, many more than two things. We see in Jairus and Jesus striking contrasts between this great leader of the synagogue who presumably has some wealth. This girl has her own room. That's not nothing. But we see especially contrasts with the woman. So Jairus has come. He comes to Jesus and he says, Jesus, my daughter is not well. If you will, but come and make her whole. Save her. right? So Jesus sets off to go do that. And while he is walking, we have this interaction with the woman who sneaks up behind Jesus, touches the hem of his robe, and is healed of this long disease. I want to just point out some contrasts that can help us interpret these stories. Of course, returning to Jairus, she finally makes it to Jairus. Jairus' daughter has died by that time and is raised, is made whole again. What is it that we see between Jairus and the woman? So first of all, we have a named male character and an unnamed female character. We have someone who is wealthy, a leader of the synagogue, in a home with more than one room, and a woman who, if she ever was wealthy, at least now, no longer has any funds from her continued treatment of this hemorrhaging problem. We have a leader of the synagogue, Jairus, and a woman who is ritually unclean. She would not have been welcomed into the synagogue for its rituals and rites because of this bleeding that she has had for 12 years. We have someone who's a parent. Jairus is there on the behalf of his daughter, and someone who is unable to have children, which of course is devastating in the modern era. If you want children, if you are unable to have children, absolutely devastating. It would have carried an extra social weight for a woman in that era, as in many human eras of human history, to not be able to bear a child. We have Jairus who approaches Jesus boldly, seeks out, asks boldly for this healing, and we have a woman who approaches Jesus surreptitiously from behind, who touches only the hem of Jesus' robe. And finally, we have Jairus who was told to keep this amazing thing, a daughter raised from the dead, to himself. And a woman who was, though not a breaking of the messianic secret, who was essentially forced to admit that she had touched Jesus' hem, and that indeed she was healed, verified to that truth in her body, knew it powerfully when it happened. We have a striking set of contrasts here. And by all means, Jairus should be the first, right? Jairus should be the one Jesus pays attention to, this man of great wealth and status, versus this one woman who just approaches him strangely. And you also have to imagine, Mark talks about these great crowds, but it's just this one woman, something special about her faith, about her plight, that allows her touching of Jesus' robe to have more effectiveness, to be more efficacious than this throng that is all around Jesus. To this point, many of Jesus' miracle stories have not been explicitly about faith. People have approached Jesus with some understanding that he's a healer, that he's a wonder worker, but they haven't been, Jesus just heals the man with the withered hand functionally on the challenge from the synagogue leaders. Jesus confronts the demoniacs in Jewish and Gentile territory. Now we move into this new section that seems to be about, in some sense, personal response to Jesus, or in Jairus' daughter's case, this sort of response of another on your behalf to Jesus. That would have happened too, by the way, with the man being let down in the thatched roof. But it becomes more predominantly about a faith response. This woman had some sort of faith, and so she was healed. I want to mention a couple other things, comparing the daughter of Jairus to this woman. First of all, Jesus calls both of them daughter. Jesus talks about Jairus' daughter, and he calls this ritually unclean woman who approaches him daughter. Really intimate phrase, right? There's a closeness there. Both are female. Both are ritually unclean because one is sick unto the point of death and indeed dies by the time we get to her, and because one is a living death, right? This constant hemorrhaging has cut her off from the temple. Both are restored to fullness of life. And I know these are not 21st century ideals, but I just want to note this. The woman who was hemorrhaging was cut off from her body in a way that made her unable to fulfill the societal duties that were laid on her. She was not able to marry, or she would have been grounds for divorce. She was not able to bear children, right? She was not fulfilled in her role for who she was created to be, how the first century understands it, but there was something that could not be whole about her. And then we have the same situation with this child who has been 12-year-old, Guess who else has been sick for 12 years? This woman has been sick for 12 years. But 12 years old would have been this kind of standard idea for when this girl could have started to begun to approach marriage, to begun to approach her societal function of having children. And of course, if she was dead, well, then that's not a conversation. That would be impossible. So the woman who is 12 years sick, the girl who is 12 years old, both are brought deliverance, brought salvation by Jesus. And they are not only individually healed, brought back to life, the hemorrhaging ends, they are brought back to the fullness of their homes, the fullness of their lives, the fullness of their being. And we can argue all the livelong day with first century gender roles. Fine. But again, the greater point being made here is something about Jesus's authority, Jesus's power, and Jesus's will to wholeness. Right? This is an incredible story. And I also want to note this. Generally, by touching a woman who was unclean or by touching a corpse, it would have rendered you unclean to perform certain duties, certain faith duties. Jesus is not made unclean by those whom the temple calls unclean. Jesus communicates. Jesus gives cleanliness, holiness. Jesus is willing to cross those boundaries and those thresholds of purity. Again, this is something we ought to be paying attention to. Even now, when we really shouldn't be touching a whole lot of people because of COVID. The idea behind Jesus' transgressive boundary crossings. I also want to point out this. I imagine that when Jairus finally arrived, after Jesus has gone through this whole scene with the woman who was hemorrhaging and learned that his daughter was dead, he was furious because he came to Jesus first. He sought out Jesus first. He was the greater man. When we talk about the last being first, it does not mean that those who were first and are now last are completely off the list. Jesus prioritizes the healing of this one woman, but Jairus' daughter is still brought life. It is in many ways a greater thing. It is not operating from a principle of scarcity. There is not just minimal Jesus to go around. And if he heals this woman, then he won't be able to heal me. There is an abundance here, a power here, a bounty. Yes, this hemorrhaging woman will come first. But Jesus will still work wonders for this child. All right. Here we are heading into chapter 6. Chapter 6 is in many ways sort of astounding. There's some strange things in chapter 6. We'll start where we're going to start. Jesus is still in Jewish territory and he returns home. Jesus goes to preach. To teach. It would have been the right of every Jewish male to teach in the synagogue. And the people who listen to him are astounded. And that astounded carries with it a negative connotation. They're astounded because of the authority he seems to carry. Again, authority being a major theme for Mark. That Jesus does not preach and teach only because he can, because it's his right, but that he emanates some great power from him. And they're a little bit scandalized. They're scandalized by the familiarity of this man. In our scriptures, we read, this carpenter, the son of a carpenter, right? What is this carpenter boy doing? The Greek there would have been used really more broadly for anyone who was in the construction field. And if we were doing a New Living Translation or a modern translation, you might say this, what is this construction worker doing here? It was used with a bit of derision. How does this man, this lowly man who works with wood or whatever sort of smithing, how is he speaking with such authority? And not even that, not only is he sort of unimpressive as regards his vocation, and again, first century mindsets here, first century derision, though a familiar one in our own century. Not only that, he is the son of Mary. You know Mary. this unextraordinary woman with all of these many other unextraordinary children who are named in this text, how is it that he could carry such authority? From the very beginning, Jesus is met with resistance. Now remember, there's plenty of scripture to go, and plenty of characters redeem themselves. But in this one episode, we have this familiarity with the man as a stumbling block to understanding who he is. No one understands who Jesus is until after the resurrection. But here there is particular confusion. This man, how could he carry with him such authority? How could he do these things? It is scandalous for them. It doesn't make any sense that this prophet, this preacher, this healer could come from their own town, and they reject him outright. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Judas and Simon, and are not his sisters here? And they took offense at him, we read. And we have this well-known saying, prophets are not without honor, even in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house. And this is what's astounding about this, truly astounding. And he could do no deeds of power. Mark, who is incredibly concerned with us understanding Jesus' authority, seems to have no problem saying that Jesus was unable to do deeds of power because of their lack of response. He gives no explanation for that. Jesus was unable to do it. Now, when Luke recounts this story, which he gets directly from Mark, he just omits this piece altogether. And Matthew changes it to, he did not do any deeds of power, rather than he could not do any deeds of power. Mark makes an absolute statement about openness and about faith. Again, we've made this sort of transition, and this scene at Nazareth is really a turning point in the gospel. We've made a transition where we really are going to ask questions about personal responses of faith, or at least openness to this transforming power. And because these people had no openness, had no faith, Jesus was in some way bound. Can Jesus build a rock that Jesus can't lift? Well, apparently yes, in Nazareth. Jesus is bound by something. Now, of course, Mark, classic Mark, makes this absolute statement and then qualifies it immediately. So it says, well, he couldn't do no deeds of power, well, except that he laid his hands on a few people and cured them. So even following this absolute statement, there is some softening, some opening. It is not yet the end of the story. Jesus couldn't do something. He did, but he couldn't. And Jesus was amazed at their unbelief. He goes along. He continues his teaching, of course. He continues his preaching tour, and now he is going to send the disciples away. And again, this is meant to be sort of a prefiguring. How exactly did Mark wants to explain how Jesus' message spread. Well, here we see the disciples. We see already all of this fame that Jesus is garnering, all of this attention that Jesus is garnering, raising. And now we see that he's sending the disciples out. I want to note a couple of things here. The disciples are not called in order only to be with him. The disciples are not his servants whom he takes away, whom he whisks away, with whom he disappears. The disciples are those whom he also sends out into the world. The disciples are those who go in community. They go 2 by 2, right? They go and they try to spread this message and to work wonders as they have seen Jesus work wonders. And they rely on radical hospitality. They rely on the first ones who will open their doors. And if people don't open their doors and refuse to wash their feet, refuse to offer them that gesture of welcome, then just shake it off, Taylor Swift, and move right along. So Jesus sends them out. I think there is something there for us, especially now. That being the body of Christ is not only, and maybe not even especially, about gathering in one particular place at one particular time. It is about going out in community and being community in new and radical ways. All right, I'm going to keep going. I know we've already got a lot to unpack here. And we have now this strange thing that was alluded to in chapter 1. Turns out that Herod is hearing about all of these disciples that have been sent out in the countryside, the 12 who've gone in groups. King Herod is hearing of them, is hearing of their work. And Herod is getting nervous. Why is Herod nervous? Here's what he says. Some were saying John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and for this reason the powers are at work in him. But others said it is Elijah. When Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, is raised. Now remember, John in many ways prefigures Jesus. We saw that in chapter 1. We knew that John was going to die, and just in the same way we know that Jesus will die at the hands of a state and a complicit religious authority. This is the first mention of that word for resurrection. The girl was made well before, but was raised. That language, this is the first time it's deployed in Mark. And that's intentional, right? Because Herod is convinced that this one that he killed is now coming back and performing and doing great things, even though he has done this terrible thing to him. Herod is worried about his own reign. But, even though we leave Jesus for an extended time in this story is still thoroughly Christological, because we have here a study in contrasts. It's not John's disciples who have come back and done these things. It is, in fact, Jesus's, whom Herod seems to have no concern with at this point. And we have also this one hugely important thing. The king that Jesus is contrasted with the type of king that Herod is. We're going to see that when we go from Herod's disgusting feast into Jesus' feeding of the 5,000. Really, Herod was not a king at all. When Matthew and Luke take up this story, this strange banquet at which Herod serves John's head on a platter, when they tell the story of Herod, they don't use the language of kingship. Herod was a ruler of a tetrarch. He was a ruler of a fourth. His father, Herod the Great, split his kingdom, and Herod ruled at the mercy of another. So Herod was not properly a king. Now, he was a despot. He was cruel. His word had power. But he was always answering to someone else. And he was afraid, just like in Gentile territory. This town was afraid when they saw someone made whole. Because the last tool of a despot is death. The last tool is execution. The last tool is ending someone's life so that they cannot speak against you. But now we've just seen that Jesus has power over that. Jesus has raised this girl. Jesus has restored a woman to life, restored innumerable demoniacs to wholeness, restored all of these people back to their proper function. And that kind of power is a real binding of a false strongman. Herod understands that his kingdom is threatened by someone who can raise the dead. Because those voices can come back and speak against Herod and destroy Herod. And that power is greater than any power he could lead and he could wield. Now, Herod has it wrong. Herod hears all of these deeds, and he thinks, my goodness, John is back. We know it's Jesus. We are insiders. We get that part of the story. Herod does not. So then we get this flashback to this gruesome scene in which Herod and John come into conflict about a marriage, about one of Herod's marriages. And Herod sort of corners himself. This scene reminds us of some Old Testament scenes, especially around Ahaz and Jezebel. This has a lot of overtones that we don't need to spend too much time into. If you would like to know about those, let me know. I'll send you an email. But we have this strange scene in which Herod is trying to project strength. He has John arrested. He wishes to quiet him in order that he can no longer do all of these great things, cause any sort of trouble. But he is cornered into killing John by this girl who asks for John's head on a platter. And so we find out, the last we hear of John, his head is on a platter and his body is being taken away by the disciples. This is a kingdom of fear. a kingdom of terror, right? A kingdom that closes itself off to good news. That's what Herod's kingdom is. So you have this decadent, incredible feast that seems to have all this joy and merrymaking and dancing and everything you might want, but it is rotten at the bottom of it. And the food, the only food that is served, the only food that's mentioned, is another strong man's head. The reason I mentioned the feeding of the 5,000 is it is what happens exactly next. So we've introduced the idea of resurrection. We've introduced all of these ideas, deeds of power, and now we see the feeding of the 5,000. There is a contrast. Who is Jesus? Jesus is the one who can bring life, who can return to wholeness. He's also one who can feed, who can provide for daily needs, who can provide a banquet. King Herod, for all of his lavishness, provides a head on a platter. Jesus, on the other hand, Jesus provides loaves and fishes in great abundance. There's another feeding story in Mark's narrative. In fact, the story of the feeding of the 5,000 is the most commonly told in all four Gospels. In four Gospels, it is retold 6 times. So, Mark tells it twice, Matthew tells it twice. I'll focus more in Matthew's reading in that when he does the feeding of the 4,000 just down the road here, but right now in the feeding of the 5,000, I want to again focus on what it tells us about who Jesus Christ is. Jesus retreats. Jesus is always trying to retreat in this gospel. We go back to this need, this human need for rest. Jesus retreats with his disciples. And he's beaten. He's beaten by all of these people who get to the place he wanted to go first. This little town that would have had no more than 300 people is all of a sudden overrun with 5,000 men. And I want you to notice that it is not the people themselves who report they are hungry, but the disciples. The disciples are worried about scarcity. Probably the disciples are hungry. Well, I only have food for me. How in the actual world are we going to feed all of these people? I do think there is something here about scarcity, because from this smallest amount, Jesus provides beyond provisions for the many. And not only that, there is so much that this is the feast of the eschatological banquet. There is food left over. This is an incredible story about who Jesus is in the context of the abundance and the provision that he provides. We've talked about salvation and wholeness. Jesus restores to life, restores to society. We now see Jesus who not only meets physical needs, allows for the provision of meals, but allows an abundance. That is who we worship. He is not stingy. He provides greatly, right? That is an incredible picture. And we will get more into the miraculous feedings when we get there in a couple chapters. I would like to end by just talking briefly about this scene where Jesus walks on water. It's a really bizarre scene that seems to provide not a lot of, it doesn't progress the narrative in important ways, but it's an interesting scene. We read it toward the end of chapter 6. In verse 47, when evening came, the boat was out on sea, and he was alone on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came toward them early in the morning, walking on the sea. This is just strange, right? It's reported as if it's totally meaningless. He intended to pass them by. So here they are straining, and he intends to just sort of pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. Again, even those who know him are unable to recognize him. They don't quite get what is going on here. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were astonished. For they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. How does this story relate to the loaves, the abundance, the provision? Well, again, we have a display of power. Jesus, with Eucharistic overtones, takes these loaves, he breaks them, he offers thanks to God for them. And he provides this great provision. And now, in a stormy crossing, the disciples are afraid. Again, they've been in this place before. And they don't understand when they see this man walking toward him. They don't understand his power and his authority. And this is such a poor translation here. Take heart, it is I. Now, Mark is not John. John cares a lot about saying, I am, calling us specifically back to Genesis 1. I am the bread of life. I am the vine. You are the branches. We've heard all of that. Here we have the same phrase, though. Take heart, ego eimi, I am. Now, Mark does not have a sophisticated theology around that phrase as John does, but he's not just using it there. He is calling us back. The one who is able to calm the storm back in a couple chapters ago, the one who is able to heal, the one who is able to exorcise demons, who brings life to Jairus' daughter, that one also has such power over nature that he can walk on water. And that is terrifying. Because everything we assume about the world when we look at it plainly, without a lens of faith, all of these things that we assumed are fixed. These systems that we assumed, well, it just is the way it is. All of those are up for grabs in the kingdom of God. There's a man who can walk on water. A little girl can be healed. The world is changing by the presence of Jesus Christ. And evil has already been bound. That is what Mark is proclaiming. These things have already been accomplished. This world can be made real. We can understand. We can live into it. We can go into this world and proclaim it and do it. But we have to know and understand that the strong man has been bound and that it means some responsibility for us to change our own understanding, to change our frameworks of reference. We have an end story here about Jesus' deeds of power, further healings. There's more of those, so we'll get to those in another point. Next week, chapters 7 and 8, we're getting to a really crucial part in our narrative. Thank you so much for joining me. Blessings this week. Be safe and do good. We'll see you next Friday.